Okay, so when you picture the untamed American frontier, or, those absolutely pristine landscapes of our national parks, what comes to mind? Probably cowboys, outlaws, or maybe famous conservationists like Teddy Roosevelt, right? But the real story of who actually tamed those spaces, well, it is way more surprising, and honestly, much more profound. So let's jump right into this explainer and uncover a totally hidden history about the foundations of the American wilderness and our military elite. Now, before we get into the battlefield tactics and the incredible military legacies we're going to cover today, I want you to picture the roads and trails you might literally still walk on in places like Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. If you've ever hiked those paths, looking up at those towering redwoods, take a second and ask yourself, who actually built them? Who swung the axes, cleared the brush, and stepped up as the very first stewards of these massive wild spaces way before modern machinery even existed? The punchy, completely unfiltered truth is that America's original park rangers were the black men of the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Yep, the Buffalo Soldiers. These guys were pioneers in every sense of the word. They were tasked with physically building and protecting a country that, honestly, at the time, barely even viewed them as human. They were sent into some of the harshest environments imaginable, just to carve out the natural treasures that we completely take for granted today. Section 1. America's First Park Rangers. Let's see how these men built the foundation of conservation long before the National Park Service was even a thought. Working under Captain Charles Young, who, by the way, was one of the very first black graduates of West Point. These soldiers didn't just sit back and watch over the land. No, they were literally out there constructing the infrastructure of Yosemite and Sequoia. We're talking back-breaking labor. They built the roads, they carved out those deep wilderness trails, and they fiercely protected the land from rampant poachers and illegal loggers. They were managing these vast tracts of land with total precision. They were, without a doubt, the ultimate stewards of the American landscape. Section 2. Origins of the Buffalo Soldiers. To really wrap our heads around their groundbreaking work in the parks, we've got to rewind to 1866. Right after the Civil War, the military had thousands of newly freed black veterans, and the institution had to figure out what to do with them. And what you see here is a wild contrast between expectation and outcome. The government's plan was basically to send these men out to the most dangerous, isolated edges of the map. They gave them rusted rifles, leftover rations, dying horses, secretly hoping the unforgiving frontier would just finish what slavery started. But the reality? Oh, they responded with unmatched excellence. Against literally all odds, they boasted the highest reenlistment rates in the entire army and quickly became absolute legends. And here's the thing. They weren't named Buffalo Soldiers by the government. They earned that title out on the battlefield through mutual respect with the indigenous Plains tribes they were fighting. To the native tribes, the buffalo was this sacred, unstoppable force. So the name was born entirely out of a profound respect for the soldiers' ferocity, their survival skills, and just their unyielding courage. Section 3. Forging the Untamed West. These men quickly became the absolute backbone of the American frontier. 18. That is the astounding number of medals of honor earned by the original Buffalo Soldiers. I mean, these were guys fighting in some of the most grueling conflicts of the era. They even famously charged right up San Juan Hill alongside Teddy Roosevelt, proving their indispensable worth time and time again. And you've got to understand the context here. While white units at the time were deserting in droves because frontier life was so incredibly harsh, these black regiments stayed put. Why? Well, in the late 1800s, putting on that military uniform was one of the very few ways a black man could find a sliver of societal dignity, not to mention a steady wage. They built an enduring legacy out of sheer necessity. They had to be twice as good just to survive the prejudice coming from within their own ranks. Section 4, the Buffalo Ranger Legacy. That unyielding standard? It eventually paved the way for total desegregation. But what's truly fascinating is how this specific blueprint of excellence bridged the gap across eras. We move from the original cavalrymen of 1866 all the way to the frozen battlefields of the Korean War, culminating in the creation of the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company in October 1950. Now, this unit was totally unique. Organized when the military was still de facto segregated, the 2nd Ranger Infantry Company was an airborne unit made up entirely of African-American soldiers and officers. Drawing huge inspiration from their history, they proudly adopted the nickname Buffalo Rangers. It was a direct homage to the legendary Buffalo Soldiers who tamed the frontier before them. And their combat record in Korea? Virtually flawless. During Operation Tomahawk, they pulled off the very first airborne Ranger assault in history, dropping right behind enemy lines. Later, at the Battle of the Soyang River, they executed a daring sneak attack to capture Hill 581. When Chinese forces counterattacked in massive numbers, these Rangers held the line. They inflicted hundreds of casualties without losing a single Ranger in that chaotic fight. No way, right? They were just an incredibly effective strike force. This legacy lived on through exceptional guys like Master Sergeant Milton Davy Lockett Jr. He was a veteran of the 2nd Ranger Company, who later did multiple combat tours in Vietnam. In 1959, he actually became the Army's first Black Ranger instructor. And he was intense. He was known for this unmatched dedication to teaching survival skills. He'd literally eat live snakes during training demos just to prove a point. Later in life, he used that exact same fearless Ranger discipline to stare down drug dealers and clean up his own neighborhood in Georgia. Just listen to the words of veteran Buffalo Ranger Donald Allen. When he recalled caring for a wounded white soldier in combat, his words completely cut through the systemic racism of the 1950s. When the bullets start to fly, everyone is the same color. It perfectly highlights the raw reality of combat, where absolute skill, bravery, and brotherhood completely outshine the artificial boundaries of segregation. Section 5. Excellence erased from history. Because despite all of this, the military structure of the time actively worked to bury their valor. The injustice here is just staggering. When it came time for formal recognition, the white conventional units that the Buffalo Rangers fought alongside and often protected as advanced scouts taking the heaviest fire, they were awarded top honors like the Presidential Unit Citation. But the Buffalo Rangers, they received absolutely nothing as a unit. Their extraordinary excellence was deliberately erased from the official, top-level record. Yet, the proof is undeniably recorded in their individual sacrifices. Look at this number, 103. That's 103 Purple Hearts, along with 9 Silver Stars, awarded to the men of this single, segregated company in just a 10-month span. The sheer volume of their combat record speaks for itself, regardless of how the institution tried to ignore it. In August 1951, the Ranger companies were deactivated, but for the 2nd Ranger Company specifically, the Army explicitly claimed in its official reports that racial differences had prevented the company from being used effectively in offensive operations. They weren't disbanded for a lack of skill or discipline or bravery. They were disbanded because of overt institutional prejudice. Which brings us to a final, absolutely vital question. We celebrate the Wild West, we celebrate our pristine national parks, and we celebrate our elite military units. But if the untamable West, our earliest national park infrastructure, and our highest airborne standards were built by the very people the law tried to exclude, we have to ask ourselves, why is their excellence so often deliberately buried? Why is the man in the 10th Cavalry uniform or the paratrooper of the 2nd Ranger Company always left out of the frame? It really challenges how we remember history. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to keep questioning the frame and keep digging for the unfiltered truth.